Alright, YouTube, it looks like North Korea has conducted yet another nuclear test. 5.3 magnitude explosion registered on the northeast side of the North Korean part of the peninsula not long ago. I believe it was about an hour ago. Not really surprising. They've been conducting these tests with some degree of regularity. This is, I believe, their fifth test now. It appears from the preliminary magnitude, when I was talking about their former test, parts of the Western media said, oh, well, maybe it was a hydrogen bomb this time. Oh, goodness. And they're, the North Koreans, of course, said, oh, yeah, this one was a hydrogen bomb. It wasn't just one of those primitive, like Fat Man style atomic weapons that we had in the mid-1940s. It looks like this one was substantially larger than the last, still not on the order of a hydrogen bomb. But it would be on par with what Pakistan's using, so I would think that people should take stock of that fact before they underestimate perhaps the nuclear capabilities. If a nation is willing to expend the kind of money and resources necessary to detonate an atomic weapon at all, they obviously have enough of that material in reserve to build at least a small number of additional weapons based on that design. Which means that North Korea, while the economy there is basically non-existent at this point, they've had several famines, they've partially alienated the Chinese. Obviously, their militarized mentality, as far as the military and their political leaders go, is leading them to continue building these weapons. That being said, it's still quite some distance from even a slightly larger style of atomic weapon. It's quite a distance from creating that, making it, testing it, actually making it work, and making atomic materials that are capable of being put on the kind of missile delivery systems that they've got. Anyone who says, oh, well, they've got long-range missiles now, they're going to nuke the United States, is fooling themselves. They wouldn't dare to do that anyway, even if they had the capability to do it, because they know they'd get annihilated. Kim Jong-un, unless he really is a lunatic, and I prefer to believe he's probably not, and it's all posturing, unless he's completely out of his mind bonkers, he would know better than to actually do that. He studied in Europe. He's been in the outside world before. He hasn't spent his entire life being taught by just a bunch of North Koreans who told him, yes, we're the imperialists out there are living in a third world wasteland, only North Korea's developed. People from North Korea travel to China sometimes for trade, business, industry. There is some back and forth there as well. So they know that the outside world is not just complete mayhem, as some people appear to believe. I tend not to take North Korea too seriously as an offensive threat, so much as I take it seriously as in, if this state suddenly collapses, if there's a revolt, a military coup, whatever happens to happen, it could get very messy very quickly and millions of people could be killed. Not just North Koreans, the government there probably would detonate atomic weapons on its own soil in order to practice an extremely warped version of the scorched earth policy. But at the same time, those weapons could be used against China, against South Korea, Japan. Those are within their range as far as their delivery capabilities. Taiwan probably. Some of, maybe the Philippines or parts of Russia. I don't think they would go after the Russians. It's actually funny. The Russians and Chinese and North Koreans are in this weird three-way sort of dance sometimes, because the Chinese tried to lean on North Korea to become slightly more part of the world economy, to adopt a Chinese mix model. They then assassinated the person that China had sort of hand-picked within the Kim family to guide them in that direction. The Russians wanted to work with them and I think got stiffed, just as the Russians tried to work with China. And Putin actually got screwed over on a pipeline deal with the Chinese. They played hardball, and he's never going to see a profit from that. It's actually very strange what's going on in that region right now. That being said, will a nuclear test lead to war? Well, all posturing and politics aside, in theory it should, because they're in gross violation of a number of bans. There's no real recourse for the world. Sanctions obviously do basically nothing because they're already completely isolated and have been for decades. The only real recourse to a solution on the Korean Peninsula is a war. And in fact, a war is still present there. There's an armistice. There's a okay, we won't fire at each other agreement between North and South Korea. The Korean War technically is still going on to this day, involving the United States, involving North and South Korea. So it's still there. Technically, it's an act of war for them to do something like this. That being said, nobody in D.C. is dumb enough, I think, to waste their time trying to force the Korean Peninsula to reunite. Nobody in China has any reason to really care about doing so. The Russians aren't really involved. Here we have a relatively small, out-of-the-way, what's called hermit kingdom, that simply stubbornly clings to the 1950s sort of mentality, as though the atomic era had just broken in its dawn over the world with its fists of radiation. And nobody really has any reason to take them too seriously, though, because their economy is so strained all the time. It would be very, very difficult for them to achieve the kind of miniaturization necessary to actually deliver a nuclear blow to anyone other. The Chinese will probably get involved before the U.S. will on the Korean Peninsula. And if North Korea were to collapse, I have every reason to believe the Chinese would be the first ones in there. Not the South Koreans or the Japanese, certainly not the U.S. or Russia, it'd be China. Because they don't want atomic weapons right on their doorstep falling into the hands of a military group that might not be friendly towards China. They'd have to march in to secure as much of North Korea as possible before the South Koreans begin the process of marching in and retaking this land and reuniting the peninsula. Probably the Chinese would end up keeping about 3/4 of North Korea. South Korea would end up reuniting with the rest. It would be much more powerful. It'd gain access to some of these mineral reserves and so forth. No, but ultimately it would remain split. And I think over time it would adopt a mixed model. It would be sort of a Chinese vassal. China would be under great pressure to reform its economic system, to reform its society. It'll begin to look a little bit like a Korean version of China. After that, reunification would probably be likely decades down the road. But yeah, North Korea has apparently tested another nuclear weapon. This time, it is larger than the last. I think the magnitude on the last was a 4.9. This one was a 5.3, significantly larger. By the way, every time you go up 0.1 in magnitude, it's a doubling. So a significant increase in its actual yield, unless we're assuming that there was some other reason why it simply led to a significantly higher magnitude, and that's exactly what it is. Yeah, they've conducted a test. It's not a prelude to war, because obviously the international community doesn't feel that gross violations of a number of treaties and a number of so-called ordinances that they impose in a globalist fashion that everyone else ignores too, by the way, isn't really a reason to invade North Korea. I don't think anybody would want that loss of life, because in all likelihood the North Koreans would immediately nuke South Korea, Japan, and probably themselves in a bitter rage. The military there would go scorched earth mode. Pyongyang would be ashes. And it wouldn't be because the U.S. had dropped a nuke on them or because China had. It'd be because the DPRK's own military had been ordered to do the same. Oh, well, we can't let our land fall to the imperialists, onward, kamikaze mission sort of thing. I could see that happening. That's about all. Peace out.